Hello, I'm Mark Cantor. I'm the founder of South Florida Intervention, the author of How to Do an Intervention, a step-by-step guide for parents, and the host of this YouTube channel, Recovery Talk. If you're new to the channel, please hit subscribe and stay up to date on everything recovery. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Josh Cagney, who holds a master's in psychology and is a PhD candidate from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Josh is also the co-founder and chief operating officer at New Paradigm Recovery, located in Tysons Corner, Virginia, which offers intensive outpatient services for the treatment of addiction. I'll have links to New Paradigm and to your social media here. And thanks for joining me. Thanks for doing this with me today.
Absolutely a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Mark.
Yeah, I was excited. I was looking forward to this. I was excited to have you. And you know, as I mentioned, our content here is fairly casual. And as you picked up, it's more about the individual than it is about our services. And, you know, so that's important too. And you and I met kind of randomly in February. I looked back at my calendar and we first met, it was February 10th. So earlier this year, before the whole world broke loose and spun out of access, off its axis. And we had a great little talk. We talked about a bunch of things. But here you are today, you're the co-founder of a well-respected treatment program. You're a master's in psychology, you're a PhD candidate, which is really incredible stuff. I wish I were. And but you did not get here easily. You had your route here. What got you here is really an incredible story, and I was wondering if you'd share that with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I guess the easiest way to sort of talk about that is whenever there are a group of us that get together, and by that I mean a group of people in recovery, the conversation invariably tends towards where did I go to treatment, right? And some will say, oh, I went to Ashley Addiction Treatment Center, and some will say I went to Karen, and some, you know, will say I went to Mark, and so on and so forth. And I'm always pretty quiet about that. And people say, well, you've been sober for a while, Josh. Where did you go to treatment? And I have to say I went to the Virginia Department of Corrections, and that was my treatment program. So in short, it was November 9th of 2003, so almost 17 years ago, I caused a car wreck while I was drunk, and someone was killed. And I think it would be inappropriate to really talk too much about the individual, other than to say he was a husband, he was a father. He was on vacation, actually, from out of the country. And his wife was also injured in the accident, and thank the Lord she lived. But ultimately, my choice and my addiction put me in a place where I didn't consciously or maliciously, but made a decision where I imperiled other people's lives. Mm-hmm. So the lesson, I mean, there are a lot of lessons that sort of come from that. But I think probably the most relevant and the most profound for me is my addiction that I lived for I started drinking when I was about 13. And I was 30 years old when the wreck took place. So for that solid stretch of time, more than half of my life, my ego and my pride and my addiction ultimately told me that the only person that I was harming through my choices was myself.
Right.
And it was regrettable that there were a lot of people around me that loved me very much who would approach me out of concern and tried to be tactful and kind and say, we'd like to help. You know, we recognize that there's something wrong. Do you think you're an alcoholic? Mm-hmm. My response to that ultimately was, I'm quite certain I'm an alcoholic. Mm-hmm. And if that's a problem for you, that's okay. The door is over there. You're welcome to leave at any time.
Right.
Which is looking back on it, it's an incredibly lonely way to live, because I just failed to recognize that my choices and my actions were hurting other people, were having a negative impact on their lives. So my recovery then has tried to be the opposite of that, where I try to engage people and affect people in a positive way and bring something positive to their lives. And in turn, that service puts us in a position where, you know, we feel better about who we are and what we do.
Do you think that, thinking back before the accident, that you wanted to get rid of these people in your life, or did you want to get rid of the people who loved you? Did you want to push them out of your life so you could focus on drinking full time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've thought a lot about that, because I know that in speaking with other people in recovery and active in their addiction, they talk a lot about the relationships that they have being drinking buddies or using buddies, or relationships that they're engaged in where they're actively using and drinking together. I really did not have that experience. I was always the one person who would drink too much at dinner, who would ruin a good party. I didn't have relationships with people who lived the same lifestyle that I lived.
Right.
And it's debatable whether or not I designed it that way subconsciously in the interest of trying to be able to get back to a more normal life, or to invent a more normal life. But I think that in the end, the few people who were left in my life who made a conscious decision to remain engaged with me were people who cared about me when I was not capable of caring for myself.
Mm.
So in the short answer, it's debatable.
In spite of yourself. Loved you in spite of yourself. Yeah.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
So we often hear people talk about when they first discovered a drink, and I know this was my case, that, you know, they walked around with this feeling, this, you know, the weight of the world on their shoulders, or just feeling of anxiety, depression, or just something that's just not right. And then you picked up the drink and you said, boom, you know, for me, it was like, wow, I've been looking for this my whole entire life. And I thought using and drinking made me feel normal. Was that your experience? Did you have that before?
Absolutely. I could certainly say I remember being pretty young and feeling not a part of, feeling disconnected from, feeling different than,
Right.
which put me in a position where I constantly felt anxious and uncomfortable, didn't want to be me. I wanted to be you. I wanted to be her. I wanted to be anyone different than what I was, because I was comparing what was inside of me to what I saw on your outside. And there was always a disconnect between those two images. So what that became was, when I drank, I don't know that I felt connected to, but I certainly was able to shut off the anxiety. I was able to quell that feeling of inferiority. And I just ceased to care anymore about whether or not it freed me from feeling different than. It freed me from that anxiety and that self-consciousness. And that just became a self-perpetuating cycle.
Yeah, I mean, the huge words you use, the inferiority, the not feeling part of, the disconnection. I think those are all very familiar and very good descriptions of what an addict, an alcoholic feels like prior to picking up the drink, or feels like anyway. Did you grow up with alcoholism or addiction in your family?
I did. My mother was an alcoholic and died as a direct result of this disease. Part of my recovery was being in a position when I was about 10 years sober, where I was able to care for her medically, physically, to the time that she finally passed. The last 3 or 4 years of her life were pretty rough, and I was her sole caretaker.
So after this accident, which is got to be something horrible to live with, something that really requires a spiritual solution on a daily basis, and then, you know, did you get sober in prison, or did you realize once that happened, was that a wake-up call? Because a lot of times you hear people go through things that are pretty horrific, and that is not the wake-up call.
No, you know, that's a great point. And I used to look back on this with a lot of grief and a lot of remorse. The wreck that I caused occurred on November 9th. and my sobriety date is November 16th.
Oh, wow.
So there was a week lapse between the time that I caused this horrific event and the time that I got sober. And I would love to tell you that, you know, after recognizing my actions and recognizing that my alcoholism had a direct conflict with the life that I wanted to live, the reality was that there were, you know, the heavens didn't part and the angels didn't sing to me.
Right.
And
right.
the reason for that is very simple. I had no way to cope with my emotions. I had no way to cope with the way that my choices impacted you.
Mhm.
The only way that I knew to cope with that was to drink and use drugs. So to be perfectly honest, I remember absolutely nothing about the week between me getting sober and me causing that car wreck. In the end, on November 16th, when I finally did take my last drink, it was not me that made that decision. It was the Fairfax County Police Department that decided it was time for me to stop drinking.
Mm.
So I was arrested and charged with one count of aggravated involuntary manslaughter, and went to jail, and that was where I got sober.
And when you're in jail, do you find that a lot of people in there, are there people trying to get sober? I mean, because I know you hear like, you know, that in prisons there's still alcohol, there's still drugs, there's things like that. So you know, and there's, you know, like going to treatment on that. I know for me, I necessarily didn't make the decision to be sober when I went to treatment. It just was no longer an option. And so at what point did you say, I want to be sober? I want to, and what resources were available to you there?
I think, you know, looking back initially, for the first year of my incarceration, I was in jail, where there were definitely stronger limits and it was a much higher security environment than it was in the Department of Corrections. I think that it probably took me about 5 or 6 months of some really critical evaluation and some help from mental health resources that existed in the jail at the time to take a look at the relationship that I had with alcohol and why that was problematic and why it had a direct impact on why I was incarcerated in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But to answer the larger question, I was transferred to the Department of Corrections quite literally on November 9th, the anniversary of the date of the wreck that I caused. Mm-hmm. And my first cellmate was a guy who was selling heroin, crack cocaine, weed, and alcohol out of our cell. Wow. And he was making a pretty good living at it. And here I am walking into prison for the first time saying, I'm about recovery. I'm about trying to live a life of sobriety. As a general rule, in the varied institutions that I was at over the 7+ years that I was incarcerated, there was an average of about 12 to 1,500 guys at any given prison. Mm-hmm. AA and NA meetings were available, and I attended every one. And out of that 12 to 1,500 guys, meetings usually had less than 10 people attending. Wow. So it was not, that's not to suggest that I think AA or NA is a solution. It is to suggest that programs that are designed to be able to help people in a life of recovery, mm-hmm. not many people engaged in that process.
Yeah, not you know, if everybody that needed it was showing up for 12-step meetings, we would need to hold them at FedEx Field. I mean, it would be.
I mean, statistically, we know that 85% of all people who are incarcerated in this country have a history of drug and alcohol abuse. So out of that 85%, you know, 10 show up out of a compound of 1,500. Those aren't really good numbers. And on the flip side of that, and I don't want to get segue too much into correctional critique, but the flip side of that is that we're not talking about a movement. And when I talk about a movement, I mean recovery. We're not talking about a movement towards a lifestyle that's supported by overall prison administration that fosters recovery or treatment. Mm-hmm. Prison is meant to be
punitive.
We call it restorative, but it's not. It really is punitive. Certainly the way we apply it in the United States.
So when you're getting ready to come out, you know, you did your time in prison, you're getting ready to leave. You must have been very concerned if recovery now is, you know, a big part of your life. Being somewhere where you have limited access to drugs and alcohol makes it easier not to drink. But it's like people who live treatment, some of them don't make it past the airport bar. It just happens that fast. Was that something you were cognizant of, or just kind of got lucky with that? Because I kind of got lucky.
I got lucky too. I was incredibly fortunate that I met some people while I was incarcerated who were from the general area, Northern Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C., who were serious about recovery and put me in touch with resources at home who were active in working a program of recovery. So I got out on December 1st of 2010. I promptly reported to my parole officer. And then the next thing I did was go to a meeting.
Mm-hmm.
A meeting where I was meeting people who I had been in contact with while I was incarcerated, who were living a life in recovery. It tied me in very quickly into a community that was supportive, empathetic, kind, compassionate, living the principles that we try and live in recovery. I would love to say that I'm responsible for my recovery outside of the correctional environment. The reality is it was entirely due to the kindness of people really who had never met me before.
Right, right. No, I agree. I've often said I've survived on the benevolence of others. Yes. So that first time at a meeting on the outside, that must have been, you must have been incredibly grateful. That must have been, what it feel like to be in a meeting and then afterwards be able to say, let's go get something to eat, or what do we, you know, or have fellowship after the meeting. That must have been quite a thing for you.
It was, you know, it was incredible. It was, I think looking back now, I recognize that the first 7 years of my recovery were really sort of qualified. And I don't mean qualified in the sense that it was easy to stay sober. I mean, drugs and alcohol were considerably easier for me to get in prison than they are for me to get outside of prison. I know that sounds antithetical, but that's the reality.
Right.
But what was different, and I sort of defer to Johan Hari, who talks a lot about, and Gabor Mate, who talk about the opposite of addiction not being recovery, but the opposite addiction being connection and engagement. I was suddenly, at 7 years sober, I was allowed to build loving relationships with other people, men and women, who really just wanted me to be okay, wanted me to be happy, joyous, and free. And that was completely antithetical to what I had experienced in prison. I had some very valuable friendships and relationships with people that I met in prison, both staff and inmates. But the reality was that being able to connect with other men and women on a much more substantive and profound level, where we were talking about shared principles and living life with the purpose of being of service and finding happiness and fulfillment in that, that was never a conversation that I had in the first 7 years of sobriety. It was a huge shift for me.
Are you still in touch with any of the people you met during your incarceration?
Every day.
Wow.
Well, there are about 5 people that I was close to while I was incarcerated. Of those 5, 1 is active in his addiction again. So I don't have any contact with him, though I check in with him every once in a while. Another is reincarcerated for a addiction-related incident. Another is sort of in and out of recovery. So I check in with him once a week. 1 is dead from an overdose. He died about 2 years after he was released. And then the last is doing well, but not exactly living a life of recovery. He's in and out of relapse, but he lives close by, so I see him once a week.
Yeah, yeah. So before the accident, was it ever on your radar to get an education in psychology or do anything like that? What path were you on professionally? before the accident?
Prior to the accident, I was scraping by, to be honest. It's sort of hard to be productive in your job when you're drunk all the time.
Right.
I put myself in a position where I had a job that I could be mediocre at and still maintain drinking.
Mhm.
But it was ultimately in IT. And it was certainly a different time in IT. And then going to prison for 7 years, where I really didn't have the luxury of touching a computer for 7 years, IT really was not in the cards for me, or at least so I
Right.
thought.
Right.
I did end up securing a job in IT really through blind luck when I got out, but went back to grad school pretty early, recognizing that the path that I wanted to take in my life was really one of service,
Mhm.
and IT for me really was not about service.
Right.
So
Right.
going back to grad school and starting to do some clinical work was very important for me early on.
Because you've come a very long way in a short period of time.
It doesn't, it's remarkable that the older we get, the less, it doesn't seem like a long time anymore. It's, I can remember these things like it was yesterday.
Right. It
Um,
goes quickly. I know.
it is, but the beauty of recovery is once we're on that road,
Mhm.
there's never an end in sight. As long as we stay on that path, it continues to go and get better and get better and get better. So I never made a conscious decision. The people who preach about the 5 and 10 year plan, that was never really my goal. I think my initial goal was to get through graduate school and to go back to work in a correctional environment, and I did that to a certain degree for a while. But then beyond that, once I recognized that I was not going to work strictly in a clinical role, my goal was never to hang a shingle and have a private practice.
Right.
It became, okay, what's next? So the beauty of recovery for me is I'm surrounded by people who constantly say, it's fantastic that you've accomplished what you've accomplished. What's next?
Mhm.
So that's what allowed me to go back to school to finish my doctoral work and what have you, and open a treatment center and get engaged in nonprofit work and continue to work in service.
I noticed on your LinkedIn you have a long history of providing service and being of service with different organizations. Yeah.
I think that's important. There are some things that we can do in our profession that offer service,
Mm.
but I think that there's a different level of service that has directly to giving of ourselves without any direct benefit, if that
Mhm.
makes sense. I
Mhm.
love what I do at New Paradigm Recovery. I believe in the program that we've set up, and I get to see the fruits of our labor. But I get paid to do what I do.
Right.
But working with nonprofits and engaging in service work in the community is a direct way where I can give back of myself freely and without expectation of any return.
Right. Yeah. I think, working in this field, not a day goes by that I don't have conversations with other recovering people. So in some way, somehow I'm still getting a meeting or two every day, but it has been markedly harder with COVID. I really, I feel so bad for the newcomer that doesn't have the opportunity to walk into a real church basement and be met face to face with people that have walked the path before them. What are you seeing with your clients at New Paradigm? Is it harder?
We made the decision, if I have to go back in time, I'd say it was the first or second week of March, after conferring with some other colleagues in the industry locally here in the region, where we made the move to telehealth.
Mhm.
Because the pandemic was so unpredictable, and we just knew so little about what the long-term consequences were. Being conservative was the safe bet. And this is ultimately what brought me to Johan Hari and Gabor Mate and their concept, their theory, was within 2 or 3 weeks, it was like our clients were going off a cliff.
Yeah.
The lack of engagement and the lack of personal attention and connection put everyone in a position, and I include myself in that,
Mm.
where for the better part of 2 months, I maintained a routine of going to work every day, and my dog and I were the only ones in the office for 2 months. no one else was here. It was an incredible struggle for our clients and for their families. You know, we could debate whether or not the struggle was simply because they were all suddenly housed together full time, and that was a stressor, which is certainly true, but also the lack of routine and the lack of engagement with people who were trying to work through the same things that they were trying to work through was absolutely critical to address. So we made the decision in early June to talk about getting back together in person and observing very strict protocols and practices to make sure that we were being safe. And I thought we were going to get a lot of pushback from the clients and families when we talked about that. So I opened the conversation in group one night, and I was astounded to find that everyone said, "Can we start tomorrow?"
Yeah.
It was
Yeah,
just that
absolutely.
fast.
Yeah.
They wanted that engagement. They needed that connection. We all crave that ability to connect, seeing someone face to face and sitting across the table from one another.
I absolutely agree. We attended an Al-Anon meeting last night and it was good, but towards the end, I got fidgety and then started looking at my phone and all those things. It's just not the same. Sometimes I'll go to a meeting and I don't know if I necessarily feel like being there. It's a good meeting or it's not a great meeting, but at least I said, well, I'll just sit here and let the sit here and think about what I'm grateful for. But, I imagine when this whole thing started that they were people who were problem drinkers or problem users, but because they had jobs, they still had accountability. They still knew they had to get up in the morning and go somewhere and shower and shave or whatever. And once everybody started working from home, for a lot of people, it's just like, well, that accountability is gone because I say working from home, finger quotes, and I'm seeing what's going on with the high school kids working from home. It's not easy.
No, it's not. And it's a great point, because when the pandemic started, I had my dissertation all laid out and had been working with my advisor to refine the research questions and understand what the study was going to be about. And by the time June hit, I made a very difficult decision to scrap everything that I had been working on with my dissertation and introduce an entirely new topic that ultimately was designed around how do we as treatment providers respond to forced isolation, the relationship that anxiety has with addiction, and what are the best practices that we can start to look at to ensure that we're addressing some of those co-occurring issues that might not have been present prior to the forced isolation. The second piece of that, though, specifically because you mentioned the Al-Anon meeting, I'm very lucky that my home group is a men's group, and we decided probably 3 or 4 months ago to get back together in person outside. It was summertime, so it was a little more friendly then,
Right. Well,
weather-wise. And guys got together, and there were probably 15 or so of us in the beginning, and everyone unanimously said, "This is the first meeting I've been to in months, and I'm so happy to be here. Zoom meetings are ridiculous. They're awful. They suck." And I sat quietly for a minute, and I have attended at least 5 Zoom meetings every week without fail since the pandemic started.
Yeah.
2 of them I chair. And to see newcomers come in who are trying to get sober in the middle of a pandemic has been unbelievably humbling for me. So I listened to these other 10 or so guys talk about how Zoom meetings suck. And then I finally spoke up and shared. And I said, I remember back to when I first got sober, and the first AA meeting I went to was in jail. And I didn't have an AA meeting because I showed up. I had an AA meeting because someone else on the outside made a decision to give of themselves to go hold an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting with no expectation that it was going to bring them something. It wasn't about what they got out of it. It was that they understood intuitively the responsibility that they had to be the hand that helps the other alcoholic or addict who still suffers. And thank God there were people like that who were willing to do that for me. And for those of you who make the mistake of thinking that you're supposed to go to a Zoom meeting for what you get out of it, you're missing the point. It's not about you. It's about what we can do to help the alcoholic or addict who still suffers at a time that is historically unprecedented.
Correct.
So
Yeah. That's a great point. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think I needed that reminder.
we all do. I have to say
think
that
I
in the
need.
mirror sometimes 2 or 3 times a day.
Yeah, yeah. Well, before we wrap up, I want to ask one more question. So, and I remember we had talked about this in February. Have you ever had contact with the family?
You know, for the first 4 or 5 years that I was in recovery, I tried to reach the family through my attorney at the time, through the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office that represented the state of Virginia. And I remember sitting in a substance abuse treatment group at a prison that I was at, that was facilitated by a clinician, a woman who was in recovery, had 20 or 30 years at that point, and talking about how frustrated I was that I wasn't getting anywhere. And she spoke to me and said, I understand why you're frustrated, but what is it that makes you think they want to hear from you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that was a turning point for me. That was a really important lesson in, I mean, I don't want to make this about Alcoholics Anonymous, but the big book tells us that our responsibility is to try and make amends to people, except when to do so would injure them. And it was the first time that I had really sort of contemplated that. So I have made efforts to reach out to them. They have not responded, and that's okay. I'm hopeful someday that they will be open to that conversation. I pray about it every day.
I'm sure you do. Yeah.
But it's on their timetable, not on mine.
Right. Right. Well, thank you. I mean, your story is incredibly unique. It took a lot for you to get here, and you're doing a lot for other people, and I commend you for that. And you really are a role model for the rest of us that have come behind, that are coming, walking in your path in terms of being in the addiction and recovery space. And so anyway, thank you, and thank you for doing this, and I look forward to continuing the conversation over the years.
Thanks, Mark. I have a lot of respect for the work that you do. It's important that we have colleagues like you, so that we can continue to fight the good fight.
There's plenty of work to be done.
Amen.
There's no shortage of it. So anyway, well, Josh, thank you very much, and have a great week, and stay safe today, because it's obviously a very anxious day, right? Election day. We'll see what happens. So hopefully everybody will be good and safe. So anyway,
That's right.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Have a
you,
great
Mark.
day.
You
too.
as well.
Bye-bye.